think their capacity to do more than capture all of Donetsk, remember they've then got to hold it, is limited. So it depends what we mean by losing. The risk is that Ukraine will lose more territory in the next few months. There is a risk that Kharkiv, the city in the north, will become practically unlivable, even if it isn't actually conquered. We've got to remember there is a real limit to the effectiveness of Russian troops. They're still not particularly well trained, the bulk that are being put into the line. They're good at doing these sort of mass attritional attacks going forward, but I don't think you're going to see some kind of sweep through Ukraine by these Russian forces.
Now, President Zelensky has said that Ukraine was unable to prevent Russia destroying a vital power station near Kyiv because it ran out of air defense missiles, as he warned that his country faces certain defeat without renewed US weapon supplies.
We ran out of all missiles that defended Tripoli. When someone says that our allies cannot provide us with this or that weapon, or they cannot be in Ukraine with this or that force, because that would be perceived as if Ukraine is engaging NATO in the war, well, after yesterday's attack, I want to ask you a question. Is Israel part of NATO or not? Here's the answer. Israel is not a NATO country. The NATO allies, including NATO countries, have been defending Israel.
Well, the Tripilska thermal power station was flattened during a wave of Russian missile and drone attacks on energy infrastructure across Ukraine. The facility was the largest provider of electricity for 3 important regions of central Ukraine. Let's talk to Robin Niblett, who is a distinguished fellow at Chatham House and the Institute's former director. He's also author of The New Cold War, How the Contest Between the US and China Will Define Our Century. Robin, really good to have you with us.
Thanks, Carl.
There have been these really clear warnings from Ukraine, from President Zelensky and others, that the shortage of weapons is getting really critical.
Yeah, because it is. And there's little doubt that Ukraine is definitely creaking at the seams at the moment in terms of its capacity to defend its infrastructure behind the lines, but also its capacity to hold the line at the front, where the supply chain that Russia has built up over the last 3 to 4 months, at the same time as blunting the Ukrainians' efforts to do a breakthrough last summer. Russia seems to have used that time very effectively to build up its capacities to kind of pound the front line with huge amounts of artillery, new sort of techniques, these rather dumb glide bombs that are coming through and taking out a lot of the Ukrainian lines. So at both sides, both at the front line, where the Russians have now, by some estimates, 5 to 7 to 1 advantage in the amount of artillery shells they can lob to the front line, and behind the front lines in the infrastructure, the battle for the economic roots of this war. At both levels, the Russians seem to have the upper hand.
Those figures are pretty stark, 5 or 7 to 1 on the front line. Presumably, we should then expect to see further gains along that front line by the Russian forces.
Well, we seem to be seeing some already. I mean, it's taken them a long, long time, but they did. Where they've seem to be focusing their efforts in terms of breakthroughs has been in the Donetsk region in the east of Ukraine, the bottom part of the Donbass region. They struggled mightily between October and January to break through in a town called Avdiivka. They lost huge amount of men, of lives, a huge amount of materiel. But despite that, they were able to break through. And having made that initial breakthrough, and now with the artillery supply declining precipitously at the front line for the Ukrainians, they are progressing now, making maybe a kilometer, half a kilometer gain per day. But this is across a long part of the front line. And the Ukrainians are struggling to go from offense of last summer into the autumn into defense, sorry to use the American emphasis here. But that transition is proving very difficult. They did not have the defensive lines already planned the way the Russians did. They spent plenty of months while we were arguing about how many, what kind of forces we'd be providing to Ukraine. The Russians built up a really effective defensive line, which withstood the Ukrainian attacks last summer. And now the Ukrainians are trying to build defensive lines while a little bit on the retreat. And as everyone knows, that's an incredibly difficult thing to do.
And what we were hearing from President Zelensky there is that it's also air defences. That is how the Russians were unable to take out this crucial power station, which has clearly had a big impact on the infrastructure across central Ukraine.
Yeah, look, through most of last year, the Ukrainians were able to take out even up to 90% of the mixes of drones and missiles that are being fired from Russia to try to take out that infrastructure as well as military installations. The Ukrainians proved remarkably successful. They even have been very successful in shooting down these Kinsal hypersonic missiles, which President Putin had claimed beforehand were unstoppable. Well, they were stopped. But what's been happening in the last few months is they've been running out of supplies. They don't have the same number of Patriot batteries. There were reports that at least one of them had been taken out by a Russian strike. And those Patriot batteries in particular are especially effective at taking out the large ballistic missiles, several of which apparently were fired at that power station. The other thing that the Russians have done is they've become much more effective at the way they time them, the combinations of missiles, going for efforts to overwhelm, very focused on one particular target rather than spread out. So the Russians have used this last year to adapt, to learn, and to get better at what they're doing, while the Ukrainians, as we know, because of the blockage of the US supplies, are now running out of munitions, very simply put.
And is that basically because of that hold up in US Congress, that they are so dependent on the US military supplies, quite aside from the equipment which the UK and other allies are providing?
Look, I think it's a mix of various things. Yes, there are less actual missiles being delivered, and that's partly because of the holdup in the US Congress. The US has much larger stocks of missiles that they can supply their foot quick rate, but they're not allowed to do so. They're not allowed to spend the money to do so unless Congress has approved that financial expenditure. And obviously, each missile costs something. So even though President Biden can, as commander-in-chief, say he wants to send it, the actual capacity to have the missiles delivered depends on Congress approving it. By the way, there seems to be a little movement forward on that, but maybe we can talk about that in a minute. In the meantime, however, we have another problem, which is that the supplies within the NATO countries that have been supplying these air defense capabilities, in particular Germany, but also France, the Netherlands, some of the Nordic NATO members, they are all running out of their own supplies. And they're hitting this moment where they have to decide, do we give all of our air defense capabilities to Ukraine? And if we do that, does that leave us vulnerable? Or do we hold a bit back because we've always thought we needed a minimum sort of guaranteed amount in our own country before we, send it over to Ukraine? And I think there's this kind of almost psychological battle going on right now in Europe to decide how much can we leave ourselves vulnerable to some type of other attack. Now, most people say Russia's putting all of its effort into Ukraine. Don't worry about it. Hand over every last air defense missile you've got. But that's a tough call for a government to make. And many of the military establishments are very nervous about doing that. And that's part of the debate that's going on right now.
Well, let's just talk about what's happening in the US Congress, because as you mentioned, there are developments there. It seems as though there's this new plan to separate out different chunks of military expenditure, which were all rolled together in one bill, so that the money for you and equipment for Ukraine would be separate from the supplies for Israel and so on. But I mean, isn't there a risk that Congress passes the backup for Israel, which of course is seizing the headlines at the moment, but that Ukraine still doesn't get what it needs?
It's a risk. I don't think Mike Johnson would be putting forward this kind of 3 to 5 part effort. There's all sorts of other bits that will be following on to do with protecting the border as well, and providing additional military support for Taiwan. So there's a whole bunch of things that were rolled up originally in that 95 billion package, which are now being split out. You've got to remember, however, that if a bill does get put to the floor, there is a big majority of Republicans, even in the House, who would vote for a Ukraine bill, a big majority. There is a majority of even members of the House, as you know, this bill, a combined bill, got through the US Senate with Republican support, and it's in the House where it's been blocked. And the reason it's blocked is that the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who only got in by a hair's breadth a few months ago, he is in a way beholden to the very most extreme parts of the Republican Congressional Caucus, people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, who calls the Ukrainians fascists and so on. And she is threatening to take him down as Speaker if he puts forward these particular bills. I don't think he would have taken this step to actually, as you said, break them out in these separate packages, talk about bringing it for a vote this weekend, unless he thought there was some chance he would get it through. Very quickly, if I could say, he also went to have a meeting with Donald Trump, who has been his backer and was one of his backers to become Speaker of the House. He went and had a visit with him last week. Now, there's been no reports out of that, but I find it interesting that he had that visit, and then there's this idea of these bills being put forward today.
Well, the Ukrainians obviously desperate for those military supplies, while, of course, President Putin just continues to devote huge tranches of the Russian economy at this battle. Do you think Ukraine could lose?
I think there is definitely a chance, and if I want to call it a high chance, that Russian forces could make a significant breakthrough this summer, spring-summer, into Donetsk. I think their capacity to do more than capture all of Donetsk, remember they've then got to hold it, is limited. So it depends what we mean by losing. The risk is that Ukraine will lose more territory in the next few months. There is a risk that Kharkiv, the city in the north, will become practically unlivable, even if it isn't actually conquered. We've got to remember there is a real limit to the effectiveness of Russian troops. They're still not particularly well trained, the bulk that are being put into the line. They're good at doing these sort of mass attritional attacks going forward, but I don't think you're going to see some kind of sweep through Ukraine by these Russian forces, despite the weaknesses that the Ukrainians have right now.
Robin Niblett, Distinguished Fellow at Chatham House and the Institute's former director. It's been great to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed.